associated with St. Michael's Church in Long Stanton, which you'll learn more about, but this is it here on the left, which was the model for the Church of St. James the Less. So we'll see if we have some folks joining from England as well, which I think is really, really great. So, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the wonderful Church of St. James the Less and St. James School. I know for some of you this is your first time here, and so after the sort of lecture portion of this, the church will be open, the grounds are open, so please help yourselves, look around. No space in the church is off limits, as we say to the students and visitors, so please do look around and ask questions and just enjoy this space and the churchyard. So I am John Hager. I am a servant year member here at St. James, which is a program with the Episcopal Service Corps. I work at St. James School. I teach religion to 6th grade right now. I help out with the community events like the welcome table that go on and lots of other things, and also with the worship and kind of community worship life, the school worship life here at the church. So this church, we have Mass for the community every night at Sunday at 5 p.m. We have school Mass at least every Friday at 11, but for some weeks, like Easter, Holy Week, we have Mass and services for all of those holy days as well. So this is a very active and vibrant place. And today's a very special day for me, actually, because it was exactly a year ago this weekend, liturgically speaking, that I visited St. James. So Trinity Sunday, which is tomorrow, was my first time attending worship here. This Saturday was my first time helping out at the market, the welcome table. We have a number of wonderful volunteers from that here as well who are very dedicated. So it's really special to think a year ago that it was my first time here. It was also my first time at St. Mark's on Trinity Sunday as well. And the reason we chose Trinity Sunday weekend is because it was on Trinity Sunday of 1850 that this church was consecrated, set apart from all common and ordinary use for the worship and the glory of God. Now, back in 1850, your parish had to be debt-free for the bishop to consecrate the church, which is actually not true anymore. That changed later in the 19th century. I think St. James missed that by about 28 years, which was very fortunate for them, because in 1846, when they started construction, the vestry agreed that the cost of this church would not exceed $3,000. By 1850, they had spent over $30,000. So as time went on, the expenses increased. So anyway, it's a very, very special day. And in the back, actually, I'll mention in a little bit, we have the original silver offering basin. It was made in London in 1847. And we know that that plate was used on the day of the church's consecration in 1850. And a collection was taken up of $39. So I hope that we at least reach that, at least reach $39 for we are very grateful for your donations for the books and supporting the work here at this church and this school. So without further ado, I also want to introduce Dr. George Asimos, who is our second speaker today. And Mr. Asimos is going to be sharing a little bit about his connection with St. Michael's Church in Long Stanton. He has a really interesting story how he got connected. And his own visit to St. James, his own first visit was, about a month and a half ago or so? So a very serendipitous collision of interests when George reached out to St. James, looking to strengthen ties between St. James and the folks who look after St. Michael. So there's a lot to celebrate today, and I'm so glad that all of you could be a part of this. What I would like to do is not blether on too much, because you can all get a book and read everything, so I don't have to tell you everything. But I want to highlight the title of this event was called Quiet House of Prayer. And the reason for that is, in 1846, when the first vestry of this parish was formed, led by a gentleman called Robert Ralston. Robert Ralston was a wealthy tea merchant. His house stood just south of St. James the Less at what is now Mount Peace and Mount Vernon Cemetery. So Robert Ralston and a group of 10 other local prominent men and their families came together to form this parish in 1846. And in the original vestry minutes, which we still have, they're upstairs in the sacristy, they record their desire to build a church that would be a quiet house of prayer, representative of the best examples of a kind of country church that you could find in England. Now, some of you might be thinking, what on earth did this group of wealthy Philadelphians in the outskirts of the city, why were they interested in recreating a medieval English parish? And there are three kind of main energies that collide in a rather extraordinary international story to create this place. The first, we must go back to England about 10 years before St. James begins and think about the Oxford movement. I won't give a sort of long history about that, but the Oxford movement emerges in England in the 1830s. In the Church of England, you have a group of clergymen. They're quite a romantic bunch. They're quite an intellectual bunch. And they are interested in encouraging people to revisit the Catholicity of the Church of England. They are interested in restoring to the Church of England a spiritual sense of the sort of power of sacrament, the power, the sort of mystical relationship between the church on earth and the sort of church in heaven. And the Oxford movement, this is important because in the Church of England at that time, this is not the sort of dominant language of the church. It's a very sort of Protestant-looking church. There's no decoration, no imagery. The sort of mystical quality of the sacraments are very much toned down. So this is a very brave thing to do. And I want to highlight from the book, the Oxford movement wasn't very concerned with aesthetics per se. This is going to come in a second. They were more interested in kind of giving a spiritual argument for why the Church of England should be looking back to its sort of Roman Catholic past. But that being said, they did value the sacraments, the Eucharist, baptism, the most important ones, as being visible things. So there's emphasis on the visible power of rituals and symbols to draw people together and to inspire them. And so I want to quote the sentence because I think it sums this idea up nicely. The Oxford movement asserted a vision of the church space with the worship that took place there as a sacred microcosm of Christian duties, behavior, and a way of being in the world. So basically, when you come to worship, and this is something we still do today. For example, when you come to worship in this church, you see your focus is directed towards the altar, your focus is directed towards the Holy Communion. You have that physical reality, but you have the spiritual reality too, that Christ and that the Eucharist is the center of your spiritual life. You come to Mass and you confess your sins. You confess your sins to each other and to God. In real life, with each other, that's what we do. That's something that Father Kellner, I love, often says to our students. When we come to Mass here, we're practicing things that we do in real life and vice versa. And each of those things are real and valuable and beautiful. And I do think that is very much in the spirit of the Oxford movement. So there's an interesting kind of spiritual tie, I think, between those things, between then and now. So the first thing, you have the Oxford movement. And then you have the Ecclesiological Society, which is just a fancy word that means churchy stuff. So around the same time of the Oxford movement, you had a group of dons at the University of Cambridge who were inspired by the Oxford movement in some ways. And they wanted to take those spiritual ideas and give them artistic expression. They said these Oxford men are looking back to the medieval past of Britain to revive the Anglican Church. We want to see that materialize in space, so in architecture. So the Ecclesiological Society does loads of work to draw attention to restoring the richness and beauty of Gothic architecture, because for them, the ideal was the Roman Catholic Gothic past of Britain. Now, there are various reasons for that, which I don't think are very important, but I think what's important about it is more so what that brings to us, what it brings back to the Anglican Church, what it brings back to the sort of wider consciousness for worship. You have a return to the use of imagery, stained glass. The ecclesiologists very much return to the use of imagery in the church. The ecclesiologists return to the emphasis on an altar at the east end of the church, a stone altar. More Protestant Anglicans use a wooden table, for example, right? Because you have this emphasis on sort of the communal meal. Whereas the ecclesiologists say, no, we want to return to this Roman Catholic idea that the altar is a place of sacrifice. Yes, so you have this kind of visceral emphasis on the Holy Communion. It's no longer just a kind of spiritual meal, it's consuming the body and blood of Christ. That's reflected physically in space with a rood screen, one of the defining features of a medieval church. Yes, you have a screen separating the nave where the people gather, the chancel where the clergy and choir sit, and it's through sort of the death of the cross that you enter into eternal life. So there's all this rich symbolism. The ecclesiologists bring that to life. They have publications, they publish essays, and for us, they send their ideas abroad. So that's where we get to the third part of the story. Oxford movement, ecclesiologists in England, and then here in America, we have people in the Episcopal Church who are interested in restoring some of these Catholic practices, who have sympathies towards this sort of ideal of bringing back a memory, a spiritual memory of this Catholic past. And so here in Philadelphia, Robert Ralston in 1846 is one of those men. We don't actually know precisely how Ralston became aware of this. I mean, the Oxford movement had publications brought over here. The ecclesiologists, as I said, had publications. We don't know precisely, but there are some clues around. He helped found St. Mark's Church in 1847, which had been founded as a specifically Oxford movement-inspired church, for example. So there are various little things we know about him that tell us he was seriously interested in this. And clearly all of the folks who helped him found the church were sympathetic to that as well. Because one thing to keep in mind about all of this is that there's a lot of resistance in the Anglican Church towards all of this. There's a lot of resistance. Contemporaneous to St. James the Less, there's huge amounts of anti-Catholic sentiment. Imagery in churches are sometimes violently opposed. Sometimes bishops refuse to consecrate churches because they have crosses or this or that. So there are a lot of contemporary examples of this. So it was quite a brave thing to do, that they would put forward this vision of restoring this little English church, which sort of share the richness of this Catholic tradition. And how St. Michael's comes into this story. Robert Ralston has a prominent churchy friend in Connecticut called Samuel Farmer Jarvis. He was a very prominent churchman. He helped found the General Theological Seminary in New York, and so forth. Anyway, Ralston and he were friends, and Ralston met with Samuel Jarvis in 1846 and discussed this idea that he wanted to build a new parish in this area. And so Jarvis suggested to Ralston, he said, write to the ecclesiologists and seek their advice on this church. And the ecclesiologists, it's a mouthful, isn't it? Ecclesiologists get back to him and say, we sent Samuel Jarvis some plans, use those. So the plans that Jarvis had were actually those of St. Michael's. And basically why the society did this is because they thought St. Michael's was a model church of the medieval English period, and we'll get into why that was. And so that's how St. Michael's came into the picture. Ralston and the others actually didn't know it was St. Michael's until the end of 1846. They started planning in April of 1846. The cornerstone is laid in October. They don't find out until December that those plans are St. Michael's. So quite interesting. And as you can see, St. James the Less would follow St. Michael's almost precisely. But one of the things that I emphasize in this book is that we shouldn't necessarily say St. James is a replica or a copy per se, because as it arose here in Philadelphia, it takes on its own unique identity, because it's in a different place. And I think one of the most beautiful symbolic ways that happens is through the stone itself. This local Wissahickon stone, it rises from the earth itself. So there's this really wonderful symbolic quality, I think. And that's exactly the spirit that the ecclesiologists are after, that this revival is after. It's taking physical things and suggesting that we as humans can encounter the divine that way. And that's something that we still do here today in our worship and in our experience of this space. It's a special place where we see stories in the windows. We look at the symbolism, the imagery. We experience worship, scripture, fellowship, and we see that as something that's sacramental. And it's very much in the spirit of the Oxford movement. So, again, just a couple more examples. You see, so construction 1846 begins, goes through to about 1850. There are still things happening up to 1850. This is just another example to show you the similarities. St. James the Less on the left, St. Michael's Long Stanton on the right. characteristic of the early English Gothic. St. Michael's had been built in the 13th century, back when the Roman Catholic Church was still reigning in Britain. And, pointed arch windows, very narrow. This is not late Gothic, where you have a sort of thinning of wall space. This is quite dark and heavy. Thin windows, pointed arches, heavy buttresses here, the inclusion of a porch, the entrance to the church. So a very faithful following of the example at St. Michael's. A side view, this is the south side of St. James the Less, and then this wonderful floor plan, which was done by John Wallace, who's sitting right over there in the in the green shirt. So just so you have the connection, yes, the south front, and then the plan, you're looking the same way. Here's the porch. The nave where the people gather, the chancel. Very straightforward plan, and yet this had everything you needed for worship in the medieval Roman Catholic Church. And so even though they had a very simple plan, it was still imbued with this kind of deep holiness because of the purpose for which it was built. St. James follows the medieval prototype in having the chancel and the altar faced east, to Jerusalem, to the rising sun, to Christ. So it follows the sort of traditional model in that sense, which was something the ecclesiologists really pushed. Again, a rood screen, sacristy was added in the 20s. But yeah, I mean, that's a pretty standard English kind of country parish. And St. Michael's, the ecclesiologists really pushed a church like St. Michael's because it's fairly modest, but beautiful. It was something that they felt when they were trying to push this revival of architecture. They thought this is an ideal that people could emulate because it's not that elaborate, but yet it's beautiful and dignified and worthy of the solemn rites that were there to be enacted. So, and then here we have, this is St. Michael's on the left, a view down the nave. Again, you see the similarities in proportion and everything. And then on the right is an old watercolor of St. James the Less. This is the original rood screen. The ecclesiologists didn't like it. They said it was well-intentioned but unsuccessful. They said, and I love it, they didn't stop there. They said, the error we trust will be rectified. This was in a magazine of, I think, 1847. So St. James received a lot of attention. The ecclesiologists publish what's going on here in England because it's such a significant project. Never before in America had a church so precisely followed a medieval model. So it's quite extraordinary. Eventually the screen was replaced in the 1880s, and we'll get there. One of the key contacts in all of this, by the way, was the great English architect William Butterfield. Now, William Butterfield was one of the sort of protégés of the ecclesiologists, and he corresponded with Robert Ralston here at St. James the Less and provided advice and also some designs for this church. So the pews, which are the original pews from the 1840s, were designed by Butterfield, taken from designs by Butterfield. Floor tiles, for example. But the most really precious thing was the offering plate, which I pointed out to some of you at the back. So in 1847, Ralston or someone here got in touch with Butterfield to have silver made for this church to celebrate the Holy Communion. So a chalice and a plate for the bread and an offering basin. And Butterfield designed this. It was made in London in 1847 and sent to St. James the Less, and we still use it every week. So it's really wonderful. So Butterfield, it's quite significant that you have this great English architect who is really a scholar of Gothic architecture involved in making this church come to life. So just go back. These are just a couple more details showing the similarities. St. Michael's on the right, St. James the Less. This is, I think, the most interesting thing. So one of the features of medieval architecture was that up in the chancel you had special seats for the clergy. These are called sedilia. So St. James the Less installed sedilia, modeled on this example of St. Michael's. But interestingly enough, they weren't seats at St. Michael's. These are actually two sinks called a piscina to drain leftover wine and so forth after the Mass. So they actually took this example from St. Michael's and used that to create the sedilia at St. James. I think that's a great detail. John Carver was the architect we know who supervised the work here in Philadelphia. So I would like to think it was maybe his creative work that sort of executed this detail. Another thing is, I said that both the Oxford movement spiritually and the ecclesiologists literally wanted to reinstate the power and sort of mystical quality of imagery to engage worshipers. And so here at St. James the Less, the east windows and the wonderful west windows, both of these were installed by 1851, 1852. They were made by very renowned French glassmaker brother duo, Alfred and Henri Gérant of Paris. Henri died sort of in the midst of this, so they were both finished by Alfred. And I think it's kind of a bit funny that only Alfred got to sign this. We think Henri died when this was being done, so Henri didn't get, but Alfred put a big AG, so, but they're very fine windows. And again, what you have here is this idea that images are powerful, and that's something that the Reformation, especially in Britain and other places, had really resisted. But the Oxford movement, the ecclesiologists, want to bring that back. You can see why that would be controversial if you were someone who had this deep-seated idea that imagery in a church was a bad idea. But for us here today, it's such a gift for the students. They come into this space, and we have all of these stories in the windows, images, not just for students, but for anyone who comes here. And that's the idea, yes, is that in these images, stories from Scripture, prophets, saints, the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, the incarnation right at the focus of the east end of the church. We see ourselves in these images. We relate our own stories to these images. These stories teach us. These stories challenge us. This is something that they knew in 1846, and they wanted to bring here to this church to those who worshipped and visited. And it's something that very much lives on. So those are two features that I want to highlight because those windows are really fine. And again, they are modeled exactly on medieval prototypes. And it's great, again, Robert Ralston goes right to the top. He says, we're going to use these two artisans who are like some of the most premier craftsmen of glass in Europe at that time. And we're going to have them do these windows for St. James. Some of you know Davis Dambley, whose, I think, perspective on some of these things is a very good one. And he said to me that this east window was probably the finest glass in America at the time. It's probably true. Quite exceptional. Really, really exceptional. Offering based on the floor tiles. Again, going back to England, these were manufactured by Minton, very famous manufacturers of pottery and porcelain. We know from the vestry minutes that Mr. Minton, the owner at the time, the heir at that time, gave the tiles behind the altar himself as a gift because he was so pleased with the work here. The tiles were relayed in the 20th century, but they are the original ones. So again, we're walking on all of this. All of this is original fabric, and it's really fantastic that it's so well preserved. This is just a photo of some of the vestry minutes. So the building committee, I guess they liked committees in 1846 too. The building committee gave a lot of reports updating the work. So that's how I found out, a lot of these details. Very, very well recorded as far as pricing. There are some mysteries still, of course, but a wealth of information can be found in those original vestry minutes, and that's how we know things, about the windows and the floors and everything. Specifically in the minutes, for example, in 1850, the vestry here gives their thanks to the Ecclesiological Society and the secretary there, so we know that they gave valuable advice and sustained correspondence with Ralston and others through the construction of the church. So that's also something that makes this place quite exceptional, is just that close tie that was maintained. And again, I just want to emphasize, it was a really international project, which I think is just extraordinary. It really was. So through the years, St. James physically has changed. All of these wonderful windows you now see in the nave, originally this was just plain glass in 1850, but starting in the late 19th century, donations, and all donations came in. All of them were donations, filling them gradually with these, with colored glass. The first ones were here in the south aisle, showing St. James and John the Evangelist. But my favorite, and I think the finest, are the two, which you can look at later, of course, the two angels, Gabriel and Michael. These were done in 1905 or so. So just an example, of how this space tracks, the history of people who have loved this place and had a connection, and therefore they have given something. Again, that link between something physical and a spiritual idea. So something really special. The rood screen, fantastic. And of course, thanks is due to Randall Jefferson, who's in the back now. But Randall has been working for some time on cleaning this screen. And it is thanks to him that I found out, which had apparently never been known before, that the screen was made by a guy called F.A. Skidmore. Now, Francis Skidmore was the most renowned metal worker of Victorian Britain, and he did all kinds of important projects. And he actually signed the screen. So thanks to Randall cleaning this, he found that signature and pointed this out, which is quite wonderful. So the screen was done in 1887. The way that this space interacts with us now is something that captivated me when I first visited here, because you have this really unique juxtaposition of this place and the history, which I have just touched on, with the work of this school today and the community life that is centered on this campus. And that interaction is something that infuses this space with new stories. We all are now a part of the story of this space. But it's also a space that teaches us. We come into this space and we learn things. And so I think that dynamic between past and present, tradition and change is something that I think the men of the Oxford movement and the ecclesiologists were very attuned to. They knew that physical space, that worship, sacrament, these encounters were powerful things. They knew that giving God our best, offering something beautiful, was something that is powerful. And I think we very much can feel that in this space now as we continue to engage with it in new and surprising ways. And it's wonderful, too, to think, back in 1846, Ralston and his friends, I don't think, ever could have imagined how this church would be used, full of middle schoolers at a sort of sung mass with incense in Philadelphia in 2023. But yes, this is who we are. And all of that taken into the imagery, the stones of this place. So that is a very brief overview, really, with some highlights of some of the significant aspects of the church. But as I say, I encourage you to explore the book and so forth. And if you're very keen on all of this, I have loads of recommendations for things you could read. But other than that, I'll maybe take a few questions, and then we'll transition over to George to share his story of St. Michael's, another really fabulous, serendipitous intersection of stories. So, yeah. Yes. I mean, the image, I think, at least from my point of view, speaks for itself. It's very heavy, it's very kind of clumsy, and actually, it's kind of pedantic, but it just didn't follow precisely enough, I think, true medieval prototypes for their liking, and that was what it was. Now, I think for us nowadays, we think, well, that's just a bit arcane and ridiculous. But again, for them, they fervently believed that recreating this spirit was important for worship. Now, we can agree or disagree with that. I don't fully agree, of course, but I think that the spirit was there. And so I think that's why they didn't approve, is that they thought, well, it isn't quite true to medieval prototypes, therefore we don't like it. So, no. I mean, the arches are a bit sort of clumsy, and the cross is too tiny for the beam for, things like this. But yeah, but they published this in their magazine in Britain, as they were following the construction, and that's what they had to say. So, any other questions before we transition? And of course, yes. Yeah, so originally from the 1840s, there were a series of iron chandeliers which had candles. Yeah. Candles as well on the altar. Now, I just have to say this because it's one of my favorite things about sort of hyper Protestant Anglicans in the 19th century. For a very long time in Anglican history, even candles on the altar, when it was dark, were kind of met with suspicion because they were like, this is too Catholic. So St. James got 6 eventually. So, but yeah, originally it was candle. Later on, sort of lamps, very similar to this, came in, which were gas. Gas came in at one point. Let's see, yeah, and then these were put in like the 20s or 30s, I think. So it's gone through various iterations of lighting. So, yeah. Mm. Yes. Well, yeah. So one of the things I will point out, and I do want to mention this while we're on the stream. So one of my dear friends over in Britain, Adam Hope, he is a scholar of the medieval period in architecture, and he wrote a little essay in the back about the medieval parish. And so I encourage you to visit that first, even though it's in the back, if some of this is new to you. And one of the things that he talks about in that is how St. Michael's would have looked in the medieval period. There would have been a rood screen that was taken out in the 18th century. There would have been wall paintings, for example. So St. Michael's actually would have looked very different as a medieval church. So it's considerably brighter, especially, than it probably would have appeared to most medieval men and women. And so in some ways, Adam says in this essay, which I really like, he says that in many ways medieval people would feel more at home in St. James now, in some ways, than they would at St. Michael's, which is a kind of interesting aspect of that history, I think. So, yes. Yes. No, they haven't. I think they've darkened a little bit because there are gold stars, which aren't very visible now, but no work has been done on them. No, I mean, all we know is that Charles Burns, who was a vestryman here, but he was involved in a lot of other churches. He was an architect. I'm sure John Wallace could tell you much more about Charles Burns. But Charles Burns designed, we know he designed the paintings, but we don't know who actually executed them. The vestry minutes just tell us they were designed by Charles Burns. Charles Burns also designed the screen. So he did a few things around here at that time. Yes. Yes. Yeah, very. I mean, it would have been right by the river. I mean, I don't know where the quarries were located. I mean, there were a number of buildings around here built with this schist. Even the mills down in East Falls, which went up in the 1850s, were built with this stone. So it would have been quarried, I mean, within a few miles, I guess. Yes. Okay. It would be flaking away. Yeah. Excellent. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have there's nothing I've come across that talks about what people felt about it. One of the more interesting clues, though, that we do have is actually about the candles, for example. So from 1850, a gentleman had given 2 candlesticks to stand on the altar. We know by the 1880s that 6 candles were given, but the vestry minutes specifically state that 2 candles nonetheless always have to remain on the altar, as was the old custom. And I think that's really interesting because I think, so what Joshua was talking about is a kind of moving even more towards Roman Catholicism in the Anglican Church. So like 6 candles on the altar, that was a very kind of Roman Catholic thing to do in the sort of 18th century. And a lot of Anglican churches started to take that up. So that comment suggests to me that people felt like we still want the old Anglican custom of these 2 candles, So that's the only clue I really have. But St. James the Less seems to have been very happy to have absorbed things. And I don't know, maybe Father Kellner can speak more to about rectors who came along in the 20th century and brought in heightened Anglo-Catholicism. Because St. James the Less would not have been a church that used incense in 1850, for example. They were not that Catholic, but they were more Catholic than most people at that time. So that was, but I think that's a good point, Joshua, how there are layers to this, and St. James reflects how people have changed and absorbed new kinds of spiritual practices through this sort of century. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think part of that is a sort of emphasis on the sort of, I don't know, in a way I think it's more of an emphasis on the kind of more decorative quality of those other six versus a kind of, sort of sacramental emphasis on these two candles, kind of, illuming the table where the communion is celebrated, for example. So, excellent. Well, I think we'll give it over to George now to share some of his experiences with St. Michael's. And excellent.
John, let's just move forward.
Yeah, whatever.
Right here.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's so nice to see everybody. My name is Dr. George Asimos. That means basically nothing in this context. I have absolutely no special authority to talk about any of this stuff. Not a student of architecture particularly, although I love it and enjoy old churches, and I travel a fair bit, and it's always, a big part of those adventures is stopping in these old places and appreciating the years of community and history and worship that have occurred there. But as far as like my credentials, absolutely nothing I'm going to say or do or show has anything to do with that. It's entirely incidental. I teach writing to freshmen for the most part. So let's just diffuse that. It's very, I'm just honored to be invited. It was kind of a special process that led me here, and certainly very willing to do it. And if anyone's watching, if anyone of the folks from Long Stanton, I really appreciate them sort of allowing me to bridge this gap and make this connection as well, because that's really the main reason I'm here, is to talk a little bit about my experience and maybe put a little bit of a personal touch on a fascinating and well-researched and very scholarly presentation in which I learned a whole heck of a lot. So I appreciate that. So Long Stanton it's super unique. So this is the church as I first saw it. Like not that it looked like that, but literally that, or at least I think it's that. It's my first encounter with St. Michael's Church was a lithograph that was framed on my grandparents' wall. It was my grandmother's. It just stuck in my mind, right? I remembered it from when I was a kid, so I kind of knew it was there. I knew she did a lot of genealogy and things like this and had a deep interest in family history. But this unusual looking church, I remembered, and I remembered what it said, right? St. Michael's, Long Stanton, and it stuck. Did nothing with that, right? Like, I was a kid and did nothing with it and did not care, and sadly, because of that, probably missed the opportunity for some clarity. She died in 2006, and the original lithograph that I saw has since vanished, right? My grandfather is not a great keeper of things, and so he's like, old church, like in the dustbin, who knows, it's disappeared. So there's no one left to ask, but I remembered. So a couple of years back, this popped into my head, and for some reason, I just felt inspired to see if it was a real place. I don't know, like I'd been to England before, but does this really exist? Was it just made up? Like, where did it come from? And only a little bit of digging led me to the church itself and pictures and some of the history, and then quickly to the Friends of St. Michael's that work in conjunction with the Church Conservation Trust in England to kind of keep the legacy of this place alive. Now, the interesting thing about it, and the reason it needs special attention and care is because it's not an active church. It's what's known as redundant. And I think I'm going to, John, mischaracterize all of this, but there is kind of a parallel here, right, between the two churches. St. Michael's is used for specific things in the community. Occasionally there is a funeral there, I believe, and some other engagements, but it doesn't even look like this inside. All right, it is not what's considered an active church, and that is because there is another church, literally like from here to the school, like right there, just as old within like a standard deviation, that is All Saints, and that is the active parish church. So redundant because you don't need these two churches literally a block away, right? It serves absolutely no purpose for the community. So one is sort of backburnered, and the other one gets, the attention, the official attention of the Church of England. And there you are. There's some conjecture on why this is, and this is my attempt at a history lesson. I'm going to try, whatever, who cares? I'm just going to swing for it. I'll put on the professor role and just act like I know, because that usually covers. Just speak with really strong authority, and everyone's like, this is incredible. Now, to the best of my knowledge, and I have done some actual research, so the separation, the reason there's two churches had to do with the ancient system of manorial rights in England, right? This predates what we think of as the peerage, right? This isn't like the Downton Abbey thing. This comes before that, where the governmental structure after William the Conqueror was sort of given out to various lords of the manor, right? So they weren't considered peers of the realm, but they had some amount of authority over tenant farmers and land. If they were raised to the status of a baron, that means they could conduct tribunals and courts and make their own law. Now, the Hatton family were the manorial lords of this manor, right? And manor is a term that doesn't just mean the house, which is no longer there, but means the entire estate that it sits on, and all the tenants and the village, and there's responsibility for all that, okay? So that's how this system of government worked. And this went all the way back to 1066 because Longstanton is in the Domesday Book, which was the first recorded little thing, like, here's my official William the Conqueror magic wand, like, you get a manor, and you get it. It's like the Oprah of manors. Like, everyone reach under the seat. You all get a manor. And that's kind of how they did the government thing. So because of the restructuring of the manor, I believe in Middle English, Stanton was Staunton, which is a unit of measurement across acres and things like that. Like, the people in Longstanton are probably watching and rolling their eyes at my terrible, destruction of their history. But I think this is close to right. And so as things got redistricted and spread around, you didn't need the two churches anymore. And as the manorial system, the feudal system decayed, there really wasn't anyone to maintain that order. So that was the Hatton family. Now, if you go to All Saints, which is super beautiful, ostensibly, if you look at it from the inside, the most attractive of the two. Now, I would disagree. I have a very strong personal connection to St. Michael's, but that's my own business. But if you were just wandering into this village, which you probably wouldn't do because it's a suburb of Cambridge, and like, kind of, why would you? Which does actually raise the question of, like, why that was on my wall and why this church for here. Like, it's, of all the churches that would have been much, much more well known, like, why? Like, why in this little town? Anyway, if you were to wander in there and visit, you would find All Saints to be the more appealing one. That has the crypt of the Hatton family. There's like detailed history still intact on the walls. Like, you can see all kinds of things that sort of indicate how the church has evolved over the years and stayed active from the time of its, since it was involved in the manorial governance of Longstanton to now, where, it's everything you would expect a local church to be, right? So that's how it started for me, was this picture. So I've been there a couple of times. Now, I was hoping I can provide all this as well. There's some detailed history about it, which actually was made fairly clear. Now, unfortunately, you can't really see. Truth be told, I'm a terrible PowerPoint designer, like, just point blank. I don't use them. I was like, oh no, I will come up here and talk to you about anything for days. Or if you give me a whiteboard and a marker, like, it's just not a skill set. Like, I just don't like doing PowerPoints. So it's pitiful. Yeah, counterintuitive. I'm slandering my profession. But there you go. I just don't like PowerPoint. So that's the way it goes. But they do know the history of how it evolved. A lot of it sort of mirrors what John had said, right? We know what it was and what it was used for and how it survived and sort of the layout. And it's very much transposed here. You can see it. As I said, the real unique parallel is that it is the redundant church piece. I mean, it is. When I first showed up here a couple of weeks ago, I was blown away, because for a space in Philadelphia, it feels like once you get off the curb and in here, I mean, as someone that's reasonably well-traveled. I mean, I don't use the term lightly, but I was transported. I just felt like I could not possibly, aside from hearing the highway. But other than that, I was transported and didn't feel like I was anywhere close to the city. I felt like I was in England. It is unbelievably faithful. Down to the spirit, really, kind of as you walk around. I mean, it is just very peaceful and absorbing in that way. So there are a lot of parallels that even kind of exceed the architecture. But even the architecture alone is astounding. So, a walk around. Now, this was the first time in March I took a solo trip, as I often do for spring break, and was like, you know what, I'm going to go bum around England for a little while, and did this whole thing. And on my route, I made it a point, like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go here. I want to see it. So I just showed up. You're going to see me in a second. I didn't look, I mean, I don't look great now, but I did look even less great then. I had been hiking for a solid 10 days. I mean, I was just a mess. I had a hoodie and a hat, like beard long, like looked like not, an oddball, basically, wandering around a fairly small town. Like, obviously an outsider. We'll put it that way. Like, obviously not from here. Of course, the accent once I talk. But there you go. So this is kind of what you walk up to. It's St. Michael's Lane. It sits right there on kind of a corner. It has a nice space. This sort of fronts the corner a little bit. So you see it coming, like you turn and it's right there. It occupies a really nice and welcoming visual space. And obviously, please mind the step. You kind of walk up there, and it's very inviting for a church that is not used, right, in that way. It's still very inviting and very open, right? And I'm just kind of, the first time I was there sort of nearing dusk. And I'm just kind of wandering around, like, I didn't know if it was open, who was there, if anyone's particularly in charge of it. Like, I had talked to friends of St. Michael's about what their needs are and maintain contact with them, but I didn't have a great deal of information on how the church itself was run or managed, or, the terrible term, like, who's in charge of it, because it is, sort of, it's more of an artifact in a lot of ways now. So, I walked up. One of the most amazing things, I think, is the Holy Well. That you could see if I go back, right? You see it right here, right there, the Holy Well, St. Michael's. So one interesting fact that I'm sure John can validate for me is that places where you see holy wells, especially when they're called or named after St. Michael for obvious reasons, typically mean, historians tend to agree, which I am not, so again, we established that, but tend to agree that this was a place where worship occurred well before Christianity. All right, it surrounded the layout of the land, its placement, usually the source of water was sacred. These things were often appropriated by the new religion and then changed and labeled St. Michael's something, St. Michael's Tower, St. Michael's Well. You'll see carvings of St. Michael in various places where this happened for obvious reasons, right? Stomping out paganism, et cetera, et cetera. So this well, which, now I don't know if this is fact or, what I was told was it was used for baptism and specifically on days where light would come in the back. So it's a very sacred place. And it's just right there. Like, you walk in and it's just astounding. You're kind of right there. And if you're, like I am, kind of a spiritual person, I just sort of felt at ease in that environment, like almost immediately at ease. And I think it adds to some of the uniqueness of that space, is that it was used and occupied as a site of worship well before even what we're thinking of as ancient, right? Even the building's ancient, but before that, still a site. It probably was the place of even original Christian worship before the official church was put down on it. So as you enter, you kind of walk around the porch door. All right, this little sign right there says that people in the general vicinity, someone has the key. Like, it's not open, but someone around has the key. Now, I'm not from here. It's like, try this lane or that lane, like, 15 St. Michael's Lane, and it's like, I look like a mess, and it's, 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and I'm like, oh boy, am I gonna go walking around knocking on doors with an American accent, with a hoodie and like a beanie on because it's cold, and gloves, and like, can I please have the key to the church? I know it's getting dark. This isn't weird. I'm not from here. My grandmom had a picture. Like, there was just no easy way to go through this. But as I walked up and started walking around, it was kind of like, well, this is now or never. Like, you're here, just see what happens. What's the worst? They're like, you're weird, go away, or we don't have a key. It certainly wasn't open. So I kind of walked around and took some time and walked around the church, building up my courage a little bit. And then I was trying to Google Maps. I had my phone out. I'm like, where is 15 whatever? And it's saying it's like in the middle of a field or on the other side. Like Google Maps did not have a very clear idea of where I was to go. So I was just like, well, I guess I'll knock on doors. So first, I asked a woman walking by with her dogs, like, excuse me, I'm not weird, but you know how I get in the church? And she said that, well, I don't know, maybe this or that person has the key. And so I started knocking on more doors. You can see that I did make it inside. So there's the evidence I did make it on side. Once I finally knocked on the right door, the key is huge. Like a medieval prison key or something. Like it weighs, a few pounds. I'm carting this thing. And they open the door, like, giving me the predictable strange look here. And then we're like, yeah, sure, just bring it back when you're done. Like, enjoy. I'm like, well, this went surprisingly well. Okay, fantastic. So I let myself in. Now, I was in there twice. So I was in the evening I originally went, and then I went in there again the next day to kind of walk around and see the light differently. It was so peaceful. It's easy to enjoy, I think, architecture and stained glass and painting and all the things that we kind of associate with the beauty of a high church. But when you appreciate that, when you appreciate the feel of a place and none of that is there, that's pretty unique. It's something about the light and the layout and the history and the stillness. And again, fine, admittedly, maybe I'm a bit of a weirdo. That's totally reasonable. I've been accused of that before, and I will own it, but I also think I'm right. A weirdo, but it's also true. It's a special place, and I spent time in there sort of sitting and reflecting. I had some time for prayer. I walked around. So the layout is a little different. Now, I don't, again, know the terminology. That's John's department, but, I mean, you can kind of see that the layout, there is a lot of similarity. Even walking in here, you can see the space kind of the same, right? It manifests in very, very similar ways, which again is just baffling to me how that became possible here. I still am stuck on the why, like who found this to be like, this is the one, you're gonna do this one. It's unique. It's unique in there. The openness of it and kind of the vaulted nature of it, there's just a very, welcoming ambiance. So, there's me, perfect. That's who they let in the house. Yeah, that's the guy they let in the house. That is actually me. They, believe it or not, they let me in. This is me having a sit and a meditation in there. You can see the tiles. One of the things that first struck me here was the authenticity of the tiles. Not so much that it's a mirror image, but they are so true to the original spirit of this type of church and to the age, down to the craftsmanship. I mean, it's just a remarkable devotion to fidelity in that area that they didn't need to do that. It's not something that probably generally the faithful are walking in like, oh, look at the tiles. But it was there nonetheless, like the extra detail that went into it and the care speaks to, I think, the love and faith that the people who built this church had to put that much extra time into it and say, no, we're getting the tiles done from here and they're going to be done like this. So you can see, very similar tile work. Some of the stained glass is still there. It is all whitewashed. Some interior shots. Again, the pews are sort of staggered a bit. they're used for various things, but stained glass has been replaced at various times, so there's not, a great deal of that. There are some plaques around that indicate its use, or, as you will see, like, given in memory of, right? Because it does mean a lot to the community. There are people that live in that area that work really hard to keep this place going and keep this place alive. And it's not an easy task. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, very briefly. I'm taking too much time. I think this shot and this shot really sort of capture what I mean, right? It's very simple, but still very special, right? There's just not much else, but there's, I don't know, something about it. Again, I'm fanciful, I suppose, and obviously I had a connection with the place, but it is well cared for. And more than anything, they are interested in the community here. And that really is my only role, right? Is being involved and sort of basically connecting this community with them. And now that has happened, like, I'm happy to be of service to them or to you, but I really have I was just the linchpin. Like, I happen to be interested in this church, and I happen to live like a couple of miles from here. That is it. That's all I wanted to do here, is just connect these two parishes and groups of like-minded people together. And then if there's anything else anyone would like me to do, more than happy. But if you just want me to get lost, like, happy to do that too. This was the only thing that I wanted to accomplish. There are some cool stories and some things left over. The church graffiti, there's some that are Mason's marks, but most of them, graffiti wasn't seen in quite the same way. I'm sure some of you probably know this, but they're signs of protection and care. These were sort of standard medieval emblems that people used to invoke a special spiritual connection, like, please watch over me. Some of them, they might resemble this one. They call it the windmill. It's probably the tree of life, is typically what it's referred to as. You see this all across Europe in churches from a similar age. Some of the other ones are signs of protection that you see duplicated. Obviously, the Cairo appears fairly frequently. There's other signs and symbols that were specifically used to request the protection of Mary, for example. Like, they all had very real meanings, and so they weren't seen so much as defacing or defiling the church as just a bit of, like, its lived history and its lived use. So it's not vandalism, exactly. A different view of the graffiti. One of the other stories, the bells from the bell code, which weigh like a ton. I guess they were stolen in 1969 in St. Michael's Longstand. No one knows how this happened. Apparently there's no one still around to ask. Was it a vandal? Well, they weigh quite a bit to climb up on thatched roof, and, like, for just a joke, I'm drunk and I'm going to steal these, hugely heavy bells. Like, that's not really possible. Some believe they're buried somewhere in the vicinity of the church, but no one really knows why. It's a mystery. It's just some of the folklore of St. Michael's. Like, they just don't know what happened to the bells or how, just not there. The community, again, the most important part. I was invited in twice. Can you believe this? I was invited in twice. The night I asked for the key, when I brought it back, some very loving and caring people made my entire trip by just asking that that's what I look like, come in for tea and sit in their living room and just have a talk and just have a chat. Welcomed. So welcomed. Next morning, the same thing. I went back for a visit and was invited in by someone else, and I sat there for a couple hours. I did a lot of fun things during that 10 days. I was just bombing around the countryside. This was the highlight. That's pretty special, I think. Like, you just don't get that very much, where someone's just willing to be like, come in, talk, tell me why you're here. Why does this matter to you? Oh, that's fascinating. And this is why I felt when I came back, I felt ever more compelled to try to make this connection, to make it something real and then let it grow however it grows. Because I think the desire, and the timing's incredible, having John here and his interest in this and his devotion to the community, I think the timing was just insane. It's just insane how this stuff worked out, that both groups wanted sort of the same thing at the same time. And there were people in place to make that happen, and I just happened to live so close. I did not know St. James the Less existed before. I only knew that after, right? When it said, oh, there's a church that's based on it. It happens to be in East Falls. Like, what? Is that possible? They have some needs, right? And I'll just express these straight out because the upkeep of the church is expensive. It's not an official parish church, so it's treated, like I said, sort of like an artifact. And so the repairs are left to the church's conservation trust. But they don't have enough funds to repair. I mean, look, there's a lot of history in that country. There's a lot of churches like St. Michael's, same age, older, redundant, whatever may be the case, that need their funds and need their attention, and there's just not enough to go around. Right now, St. Michael's needs the beautiful, beautiful thatched roof repaired. That costs something like, I don't know, 25,000 pounds, I believe. And to their incredible credit, I think they've raised about half of that on their own. The bell coat needs to be architecturally checked. There's some minor repairs that need to be done, but how much that's going to cost or what the needs are going to be, is uncertain at this point. And the list is going to go on, because to keep these treasures alive and available for the next generation, there has to be concerned people that are willing to engage with them, wherever that might be. I know that probably all churches, especially of a certain age, go through these struggles with membership at the moment, or funds at the moment, or whatever the case may be. And they certainly understand that as well as I do. But as things develop here, there might be opportunities to build further relationships that benefit both communities. They would be very interested in doing an exchange. They do regular events there that could be held in tandem with events here. I mean, this is so well attended. It's possible that something like that could be a reality. So if you'd like more information, obviously Friends of St. Michael's has a Facebook page, like everybody does. Or you can just email them directly. They're super friendly. They'll pass on any information in history like they've done to me. They will answer all your questions way, way better than I've been able to. And of course, if there's ever anything I can do, or you have any questions, or you're interested in traveling there, anything I can provide, I'm 100% available to that. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, George. That was fabulous and so wonderful to hear, I think, a story of resurrection, really, both of these places share in their own way, which is something precious. And again, the power of these places to inspire us is something that they both share. So that was really wonderful. Just before we end this portion, I just want to specifically thank George again for his being here and his energy to contribute to this project. No.
Thank you. Would you let that guy in? Come on, do it. I don't know.
So thank you again to him. Thank you to all of you for being here and being a part of this. Thank you specifically. I just want to announce while we have the stream on to my friend Adam Hope again for contributing to this project. And again, I encourage you to read his essay. And I thought you mentioning the bells was perfect, because Adam ended his little essay by commenting on the bells, being taken at St. Michael's. And it's wonderful here that the bells now again, resound around this neighborhood for worship and things. So wonderful. Just as they would have done in the medieval period, striking the hours, striking the moments in the Mass, striking the Angelus. The Angelus still rings on the Wanamaker Tower at 6 noon and 6 p.m. So really, really wonderful. And I also want to thank John Wallace for helping out with some things with this, as well as Daniel McKay, one of my good friends over in Britain, who did all the photos in this book at St. Michael's. So thank you to Daniel. And also thank you to Dave Kasevich, the head of school, for doing a lot with this, most importantly helping to proofread this and so forth and making some edits, and Father Andrew Kellner, who we are now going to proceed at last to refresh ourselves with some libations and nibbles. So I think that deserves a round of applause. So once again, thank you very much. And the space is open and here. And yes. And I yes, and the offering basin is there, ready to receive